You guys, I don't know how I've never read this book. It's an older book. It was published in 2008, but somehow I never read it. But it is one of the most beautiful, emotionally resonant books I've ever read. And honestly, if you get to the end of it and you don't cry hysterically, I really don't know if you have a soul. Okay, actually, I do know how I have not read this book. I actually started reading this book about 11 years ago, and I began reading it when I was pregnant with my daughter. And it's just one of those books that if you have that sort of heightened emotional sort of energy in your life at the time, if you're going through a hard time or if your hormones are raging for some reason, like if you're pregnant, it's not a good time to read this book. This book is a very hard book. There's a lot of hard things in this book, but it's one of those books where it's worth it. It is worth the hard things that you have to endure because it is such a beautiful book. And that book is A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. So one way that I saw this book described on Goodreads, and this is a good way to describe this book, and I'll just read it here. Someone wrote on Goodreads, "Apparently this will break my heart even more than The Kite Runner." Update, it did. Yes, you've probably heard of this book. It was the second book of Khaled Hosseini. He had his super popular mega hit book, The Kite Runner, which is also one of my favorite books and which will also make you cry. It is gut-wrenching, just emotionally resonant. It will make you cry as well. The Kite Runner was such a runaway success. I think it spent, 100 weeks on the New York Times bestselling list or something like that. It was such a beautiful book. But A Thousand Splendid Suns was just as good, if not better. It was so beautiful. It's interesting to me that Khaled Hosseini is as good a storyteller as he is because he didn't start out his life as a professional storyteller. He started out as a doctor. And I don't know, I just think of doctors as like dry. I don't know. I don't think of them as some of the greatest storytellers that are alive in modern times, but it's not that doctors don't publish some super popular books, but they usually have something to do with being a doctor or science or something like that, right? So to just think of somebody who sort of comes from that analytical of a field who is actually that great of a storyteller, that's a very interesting point in terms of all of Khaled Hosseini's books. When I first started reading this book for the second time, I thought the same thing the first time and the second time. I thought to myself, I don't know if I can read a book about women in Afghanistan because it's just too sad. I don't know if I want to just constantly be having those images buffeting my brain, but he is such a gifted storyteller. He just immediately draws you in. He immediately makes you feel that his characters are real. And this is something that, in my opinion, is really hard to do as a writer. I think it's much easier to come up with a plot, to come up with an interesting plot, to push, sort of the narration along, but to make you feel for those characters so that when one of those characters dies, it's almost like somebody who has died. I remember when I was 8 years old and my dad read me The Lord of the Rings, and then we got to the end when Frodo goes to the Grey Havens and Sam doesn't, and it was so heartbreaking to me that I literally cried myself to sleep. I was screaming and I was yelling, why don't they get to stay together? This isn't fair. But it was very emotional, right? The characters were real and alive, and I've always sort of looked for books like that. I've always wanted to read books that are like that. And of course, as you get older, you become jaded, right? You harden your heart, or at least I have, right? So it's harder and harder to sort of squeeze those sort of emotions out of yourself, right? But A Thousand Splendid Suns, it really does this. It really does just squeeze the emotions out of you. Now, this book is about two women. One of them is named Miriam. She is born out of wedlock to a wealthy man and to a woman in Afghanistan of low station. And by the time that she's 15, she's sent off to Kabul to marry an older man who's not nice, right? She's not kind. She's sort of just thrown away. And then later on in the book, you meet Layla, who is a lot younger than Miriam, and she is sort of born into much different circumstances. Her parents believe that women should be, part of society, that girls should be educated. It's a much different environment that she is born into. And in a sort of cryptic foreshadowing of the story in terms of what happens, there is a part in the story when Layla's dad says to her, because the story begins when the Soviet Union is occupying Afghanistan, and he makes a cryptic remark. He says, the Soviets occupying Afghanistan means that it actually is a good time to be a woman in Afghanistan because the Soviets want to educate the girls. They want women to be part of society. And it's a very chilling remark, and one that still sticks with me because never do you really think of Soviet occupation as a good thing, right? I mean, most of the time when you're hearing about this, you're hearing about horrible things that are happening in the country or the area that is being occupied. So it's a very chilling remark, and it gives you an idea of what these two women have to endure. And this book is really about these two women's friendship. They sort of come together because of some terrible circumstances that happened throughout the history of Afghanistan. And again, there are some really, really hard things in this book. It is a hard book to read. Definitely, check the content warnings. Definitely check to see if it's really the kind of book that you want to read. But it's definitely worth it. And let me know in the comments down below. Have you read this book? If you have, what did you think of it? And what are some other books? What are some other books that just, are very, very emotionally resonant? What are some other books that if you don't cry at the end, then you probably don't have a soul?